valuable insights regarding the contribution of our non-human animal friends and how this relates to the capitalist phenomenon of modern alienation from the means of production and the inherent value of all beings, which is obscured by their current social position as parts of the profit machine. Just by way of introduction, my name is Agatha, and I'm an undergraduate student at McGill University in Quebec, Canada. Maude here is also an undergraduate at McGill, and Isaac has recently graduated. We are all studying philosophy, political theory, and environment. So our presentation today is less of a presentation and more of a strategy session. We hope that our time today can serve as a synthesis of the ideas and tactical discussions that we've shared this weekend. We will be taking notes on our discussions today, and we'll compile a summary of proposals, problems, and suggestions, which we hope that we can send to SCAS so that it can be forwarded to all of you. As per format, Isaac and myself will speak firstly to the exclusion of non-human animals from political activity. We'll pause to discuss strategies and experiences of political actors. And afterwards, Maude will bring us from the political to the personal, because we all know that the personal is political. But the personal is also emotional and psychological. So she will discuss how these kinds of considerations are important with regards to our one-on-one interactions with people who may or may not be sensitive to the oppression of non-human animals. So as Leslie mentioned yesterday, many of us, although we hold veganism or anti-speciesism as a crucial aspect of our identities, participate and coordinate varied social movements, which, as it stands, exclude animals from their fights. We often find ourselves asking, how can my allies not be vegan? How is it that our wonderful comrades don't share with us this realization that the liberation of animals is the unspoken and oft-looked-over consequence and aim of our political practices? As many of you may know, this past year saw an enormous social movement in Quebec. I'm going to begin by giving a brief history of the movement in question. In February 2012, after 2 years of protests, petitions, and occupations, students across Quebec voted to go on an unlimited general strike against the Liberal government's plan to increase tuition fees by 75%. The months following the strike declaration were the most politically intense time in Quebec or Canada in recent memory, as students' demand for a moratorium on tuition fees became merely representative of a broader struggle against neoliberal policies, the failed logic of austerity, and the weakening of the democratic institution. The oft-repeated slogan became La grève est étudiante, la lutte est populaire, which means the strike is by students, but the uprising is popular. The social movement was referred to as the Printemps Arabe, or the Maple Spring, in reference to the democratic uprisings in the Arab world in 2011, and as part of a global resurgence of leftist resistance. As the strike continued on, demonstrators faced intense government repression, violence, injunctions, and the passing of what became known as the authoritarian baton law, Law 12, which was effectively passed so as to declare any and all protests of over 50 people illegal. Many legislators, judges, citizens, and comrades decried this move by the government, and after months of nightly protests in the streets, the tuition hike was cancelled, and the Liberal government was not re-elected. This movement was the longest student strike in Quebec history and has deeply shifted the level of political and activist engagement in cities all around our province. Despite the broadening scope of the movement, which started with tuition increase and went on to new liberalism and its offshoots, there were still issues that had to be dealt with. In fact, the movement had been carrying on some racist, sexist, and colonial bullshit. Some demonstrations tended to take on a Québécois nationalist tone, using the slogan that was popular in the 1960s with progressive Quebecers, Maître chez nous, which means we are masters in our own house. But the question asked by ourselves and by many of our comrades of lower-income backgrounds, women, Indigenous folk, comrades of color, and queer allies was, who are the masters here? Is this movement about the access of education for some universal, classless, genderless, colorless prototype of the student? Because we all know that that doesn't exist, and what gets placed into the social imaginary when we refuse to adjust the terms of our discourse so as to explicitly include our marginalized comrades, well, it ends up being a heterosexual white male. These issues were discussed within the movement and gave rise to larger questions. How do we participate in a social movement, all the while remaining quiet about the contradictions involved in some of our actions? Someone earlier this weekend spoke about the idea of stealing thunder, or the questionability of handing out flyers for your own cause at a gathering of allies. And Leslie yesterday spoke about the exclusivity of the animal liberation movement, in that it involves a level of commitment that makes itself apparent in everyday life. But I would suggest that instead it doesn't do so more than any other movement. Although dietary restrictions may be a more salient form of commitment, The choices that we make are less apparent than the actions we consciously take in social movements to recognize our own level of privilege, all the while fighting a larger common enemy. Our dietary choices, consumption practices, and non-speciesist language may to some extent raise awareness, but the truth is that today, non-human animals are the ghosts in our lives. They are, by virtue of the nature of our political institutions and practices, largely excluded. Many aspects of the Quebec student movement were called out for being racist, sexist, or heteronormative, but we never asked the question, how does the privatization of universities affect non-human animals? Now, this is especially discouraging in Quebec, as our home province has a horrible history of animal rights abuses. Activists estimate there are approximately 1,800 functioning puppy mills in Quebec today, producing over 4 million animals, which are distributed in Canada and the US in classified ads and through other discrete channels. I don't think these kinds of figures need to be spouted here. However, it was often important to note to our fellow comrades in last year's struggle that our province is not doing so well in terms of preventing cruelty to animals. What's more, many universities in Quebec have become, and everywhere actually, have become research heavy and are implicated in much animal cruelty. I found that being implicated in the social movement was a powerful experience, but it was also discouraging for the plight of animals not to be recognized by the very minds and bodies which I thought were most likely to sympathize with the animal liberation struggle. Whence came the question that we're asking today. How do we reconcile our commitment to animal liberation with our participation in struggles that exclude animals from their fight? Yesterday, Zach referenced the statement of the Combahee River Collective, which is a crucial text in understanding how frustrating it can be when a movement, in fact, isn't your movement, and discounts the perspectives you and your comrades have to bring. As activists who recognize the oppression of other animals, we should especially not let their condition be silenced by the goal of larger political struggles, which, as Isaac will discuss, are struggles that affect our non-human friends. As a student of feminist philosophy, I'm always shocked that many of my activist, feminist, and queer friends continue to EB. After bringing up the connections between othering structures that oppress women, people of color, and people with disabilities, as well as non-human animals, I usually just recommend that they read The Sexual Politics of Meat. Because there is a deep-rooted contradiction that arises whenever we discuss the question of non-human animals. We are at once everywhere, and they are nowhere. Non-human animal bodies are used everywhere, to make glue, to make clothing, to feed humans, for entertainment, and to serve as tools for scientific research. Not to mention the emergence of an internet culture that is literally all about cats. But I would draw a similar distinction to the one drawn by our deconstructionist friend Jacques Derrida in The Animal That Therefore I Am. This culture is about cats as we call them cats, but not as they are cats. We see non-human animals everywhere, but we do not see them, in that we often don't recognize their subjectivity and their distinct forms of agency, affect, and expression. As Carol Adams points out, non-human animals, much like women, are the absent reference in our cultural discourse. They are referred to everywhere, but they are referred to as objects. They are nowhere. As urbanization continues and cities become more and more populated, we often interact with non-human animals less and less. This can also be pointed to as a factor of the current state of our oppression of non-human animals, although it is certainly not the only one. In North America, it is an uncommon thing to spot non-human animals in public spaces. Dog parks are a thing, but separate is not equal. The question that has been on my mind of late is why there are not more actions that have as their aim the subversion of the social norm that public space is exclusively human space. A question that I wanted to ask is it effective to directly challenge these norms? Why not bring our non-human friends onto the bus with us, to the grocery store, to our campus? Would this be an effective method of raising the awareness about the speciesism they face? Tying it back to the Quebec movement, where was the representation of non-human animals in our movement? Why was it not acknowledged that the same neoliberal government which was responsible for the increased privatization of universities, the increased financial burden on students, and the perpetuation of the edu-factory as norm, the very same government which was passing policies which were harmful to non-human animals? The link can be drawn so as to include their suffering. In the Maple Spring, for example, our goal was to stop the increased privatization of universities, along with neoliberal politics that were calling for increasing austerity measures. But we can also argue that these links can be drawn between this political movement and the animal liberation movement, because we can attribute the oppression of